Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to Fronteras and Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. One of New York's oldest state prisons has a long-running educational program. Since the 1990s, faculty from Cornell University have taught classes for inmates at the Auburn Correctional Facility. But a few inmates want more. They've started their own theater group based on strong group discipline and trust. Here's the story.
The Auburn Correctional Facility is one of New York's oldest state prisons. It also has a long-running educational program. Since the 1990s, faculty from Cornell University have taught classes for the inmates. But a few inmates wanted more, so they started their own theater group. They meet in a bare classroom inside the prison's school building. Today, they have an unusual opening exercise.
You must eat now.
No?
It's better in the sunlight.
It is better.
Yes, it is.
Photosynthesis.
I'll see you.
It's a Snow White skit, unusual for a maximum security prison. The Phoenix Players Theater Group started with 2 inmates at Auburn in 2009. Now it's grown to a dozen members. The men meet every Friday for acting exercises like this one and to practice monologues. They run the whole thing on their own.
A horse! My kingdom for a horse!
Inmate Michael Rines was one of the group's founding members. He says it's really important that the group is self-directed. The men did have to find a facilitator from the outside, a prison requirement. Rines chose a Cornell theater professor, but not until he'd interviewed him for the job multiple times.
We were looking just for somebody to come in and let us get the opportunity to know ourselves.
Now that professor's retired, and Bruce Levitt has taken over. Levitt also teaches at Cornell. The Snow White skit was his idea. Next, he leads the men into an even more personal exercise. They perform material they wrote themselves.
Look, I got a pistol here, and you're not going to have to watch. Those savages cut my head off like they did with Foley.
Adam Roberts is one of the group's newest members. He plays a hostage imprisoned in Syria.
It'll be all right. It'll be all right.
The group is clearly a link to the real world for these guys. Current events keep coming up in the monologues. Roberts says that's why he comes to the group.
For me, like, it's a dose of reality, a dose of humanity, like once a week.
And Levitt says acting gets the men ready to live on the outside, too. He recalls a piece from last year's performance that was especially powerful.
We staged the crime that one of the guys had written out, that he'd committed, and he was in tears, saying, "This is the first time I've witnessed my own crime."
I am forbidden to tell the secrets of my prison house.
Unless you can begin to absorb that and translate it into some positive action, you leave prison seeing yourself as someone who is irredeemable. It's much easier to commit another crime.
With all that personal expression, this has to be a safe space. In other words, what happens in class stays in this room. That means the men are careful when they pick new members. New guys have to be invited before they can even apply. And Rines is strict about attendance. Sheldon Johnson is fairly new to the group. For him, it's about learning to express emotions.
Through sickness and health. Love is when a mother sees her infant for the very first time escaping from the womb to breathe its first breath of life.
Nobody wants to be vulnerable in prison. You know, it just goes back to like when you're growing up and they say boys and men are not supposed to cry. And here, you're not supposed to be emotional and you're not supposed to complain about what's happening.
Johnson says that makes prison really artificial. The way he normally communicates in the prison is nothing like what he would need to do on the outside to talk to his family or to get a job.
Because you got rules in prison that don't exist in society. You know, it's like things are moving in society, and prison is almost like it's almost like the Flintstones, and everybody in the street is in the Jetsons.
Love is undying, ever multiplying. Love is undying, ever multiplying. I'm stuck.
David Bendizu was one of the original Phoenix players. He says the group gives inmates space to be themselves. He refuses to call it a rehabilitation program.
Because to rehabilitate means to fix, means to fix someone. And this program, it's a free space. You can grow. You can be who you naturally were before you committed your crime.
After the men finish their monologues, Bendizu gathers everyone in a circle to close. He says when he first joined, he would skip practices to avoid this part of the meeting.
When I leave here, I get this depressing feeling inside of me, like, damn, I want that love again, and I don't get it, so that's why. Sometimes I don't want to feel that.
He doesn't skip anymore. Now he leads the group in their motto.
We are a community of transformation. Through the power of self-discovery, we create the opportunity to know and grow into ourselves. 1, 2, 3, PPTG. Woo!
Professor Mike Tapia joined the faculty at New Mexico State University in fall 2015. His teaching and research interests include street crimes, race and crime, juvenile justice, and crime theory. His latest work examined Chicano street and prison gang organization in historical perspective. Professor Tapia has just published a book called Barrio Gangs of San Antonio, 1915 to 2015. Professor Tapia, welcome to Fronteras, Changing America.
Thank you for having me, Edmundo.
What first attracted you to working with gangs and also just gang history?
Well, my first job out of college in San Antonio, I went to St. Mary's University, and I went to the job board after graduating as a political science major, didn't know what I would do, found a job description about gang intervention, got the job, and that was in the mid to late 90s. And that just allowed me to immerse myself in that whole world of Chicano street gangs in another city, but that's where I got my start.
Well, you grew up in El Paso.
I did.
Was there much gang activity growing up for you?
Yeah, I think I would say so, and that has been the case historically. And I'm from the Lower Valley in Isleta, which is pretty well known for lots of that sort of thing.
How far back did you go in studying gangs? You went to 1915. Why was that such a pivotal year?
It's really just when I felt it got its start in studying the archives, newspaper archives mostly, and it just seemed to be just about when it turned into a more of a serious social problem for the city of San Antonio, and that was just reflected in those records.
How did those gangs initially start?
That's probably the crux of the work itself is just to see, theoretically, where do these gangs form? How do they get their started? So, I mean, it's what you would kind of idyllically see in a movie like The Gangs of New York or something like that, kind of like unsupervised street corner play groups, really, back in that day.
And where did those groups migrate from? Were they originally from Mexico? Were they long multi-generations in San Antonio?
I would say that they are native to Texas. Of course, the origins, the ethnic and national origins of the boys, street corner boys in that day, were Mexicanos. But no, I mean, for the most part, they were all born on the Texas side of the border.
Let's talk about peak activity for gangs. You studied from 1915. Were there any peaks between 1915 and 2015?
There were two really clear, identifiable peaks, which was about the early 50s, really the whole decade of the 50s, but early 50s seemed to be pretty profound. And then throughout the decade of the 90s. Really starting in the late 80s, early 90s was horrific. 1993 is really the peak of all violence in the United States, and gangs included. And aside from those two others, there's been fluctuations, but those are the clear peaks.
Let's talk about the 50s. What caused there to be a peak in the 50s?
That's an interesting question. I mean, it's hard to say. You know, I interviewed men that were early teens in the 50s, and you know, I mean, as a teenager, I guess it's hard to analyze what's going on. But I think just the lack of things to do, really, like the lack of recreational activities, a critical mass of young boys, in the inner city at that time, and that's just a simple fact of our discipline, is that when you have such a large age group, mixing it up in any society, well, there's going to be a lot of friction.
Was there a lot of racial divide in San Antonio in the 50s that caused them to want to separate themselves from other communities?
Yes. I wouldn't say that they separated themselves, although some might argue that, but I think it's more of a structural thing, in cities. The way they're laid out is they tend to, be segregated along the lines of race and class, and those two things stick pretty closely together. So whether it's out of preference or out of, kind of design, larger structural design, you hear stories about crossing the, this side of the tracks or that side of the tracks. Yeah, that was very much the case in San Antonio.
Let's talk about the 90s. What caused there to be such a peak in the 90s? And not just the peak, but violence. It was pretty violent in the 90s.
Right. So in my work, in the 20, some years that I've spent studying Chicano gangs, I've talked to a lot of gang cops, right? Gang detectives and so on. And some of the best ones will really, really attest to the influence of media. Rap music, gangster rap music had such a profound impact in their mind. And it's pretty undeniable, right? I mean, just what it did to the psyches of kids, it
popularized it.
Big time. It ghettoized a lot of inner cities in terms of just the thought processes, the culture, the language, and it glorifies, extreme violence, right? And then you can't ignore, just kind of with the passage of time, how technological advances in weaponry, right? So you had weapons coming out like the MAC-10 and, street sweepers and Uzis and all these military-grade weapons that were hitting the street, because, and that's a larger discussion about America's fascination with guns and
yes.
violence.
What is the difference in gang activity with first-generation Latinos and multi-generational Latinos? Does assimilation play a role in gang activity?
It certainly does. And that's a popular, theme that we're dealing with right now under the Trump administration. It's very, hot topic.
Because that's one of the things that he recently came out against the MS-13, correct?
Right, and and not just them. I mean, pretty much branding all Latinos as criminogenic, at least early in the campaign. But it's quite the contrary. You look at the criminological, literature, the research on this, and it couldn't be further from the truth. It's your recent immigrantes that are the least criminogenic. And we can all probably guess the reasons why, right? They try to fly under the radar. They don't want to be detected and deported, especially if they're here illegally. But Latino immigrants tend to have a really strong work ethic, but it's as the generations go on, it's their children and their grandchildren that assimilate to American culture, which, as we said, is a very hyper-violent culture and a very ghettoized, glorification of gangs and stuff. So they fall into it.
What are some of the criminal enterprises that these gangs participate in, and how has it evolved?
Yeah, I mean, that is what makes my job so interesting, is because it's everything, from, of course you have your first offenders. We've got programs in Las Cruces to deal, with that sort of thing. it's not everybody that continues into a life of crime, right? So, you know, street gangs are known to do everything, you know, from petty, you know, crimes, you know, real minor misdemeanor stuff. And then it goes with age, you know, it increases with age in terms of severity. If they do pair up with adult gangs, or if their family members are members of adult gangs, or if, you know, they're, you know, come from families that are deeply entrenched in the criminal lifestyle with a lot of ex-convicts and stuff like that, then those tend to be the most serious types of juvenile gangs.
Is it difficult? You talk to a lot of former gang members. How difficult is it for them to leave the gang lifestyle?
Well, you know, there is a lot of, I would say, there's a lot of, you know, false beliefs about, you know, the whole blood in, blood out, you know, mantra that you hear, right? That is true of some gangs, mostly prison gangs, right? Adult, really serious criminal enterprises. For street gangs, you know, they really are not that sophisticated. Again, some are, right? But, you know, for the most part, it's just a passing phase, you know, for most kids that they go through. In all the people that I've interviewed of all different age groups, you know, people move on and they get on with their lives, and some of them even become professionals.
Let's go back to talking about pop culture. How much of an impact does pop culture have with these kids?
I think it's pretty tremendous. You know, even before the advent of social media and, you know, all the electronic and technological gadgets that kids of this generation have, I mean, it was in the music, right? You know, the gangster rap craze just swept across the nation, you know, from LA. As LA goes, you know, so does, or as California goes, so does the nation. And it really did take the nation by storm, you know. And we're not just talking black kids in ghettos, you know. Mexicanos in the barrios, and, you know, kids of all races and backgrounds, you know, really took to this.
What is the racial divide in gangs, especially right here in our community of southern New Mexico and also West Texas?
Well, you know, typically there is a pretty clear racial divide, right? In most cities, especially, you know, if you look in the prisons or even in juvenile, you know, correctional facilities, those tend to be a microcosm of, you know, of the larger world. You know, if you just look at residential patterns, you know, across the U.S. in major cities, they are very highly segregated by race. So gangs, you know, are, you know, there's nothing special about them in that regard. You know, it's kind of like where you grow up, you know, what's the race ethnic composition of that neighborhood, and that'll tell you, you know, that'll reflect itself in the gang. But yeah, there's racial warfare, right, in prison. There's, you know, we have plenty of evidence of that. Las Cruces and the borderland region, I'll say Las Cruces in particular, in the research I've conducted here so far, presents an interesting exception, I guess. It's an interesting case in that regard, because our street gangs tend to be pretty well racially mixed. I mean, not to a very large extent. We're mostly Chicano, Mexicano. I would say like 80% of a street gang, but there are black and white kids, you know, involved in the mix. And I just think, you know, when I moved here 2 years ago, that struck my wife and I as just kind of like looking, you know, just walking through the supermarket or whatever, that we did see a lot of kind of racially mixed couples, you know, married couples and so on. So you see that also in the gang population.
You've moved your research and are currently researching borderline gang activity and looking at Las Cruces. What surprises you the most about gang activity in the Las Cruces area?
Well, it doesn't have as deep of a history, that's for sure, right? This is traditionally a college town. You know, its economic drivers have been, you know, agriculture and the base, you know, and white sands and that sort of thing. So it's not, you know, it doesn't have all the typical ingredients, right, to create such a very dramatic, you know, gang problem. But it was here, you know, it was undoubtedly, you know, you can ask, like, let's say retired gang detectives or, you know, some of the veterans, and just look at the newspaper archives and talk to, you know, some of the folks that are still around, and Las Cruces does have a pretty serious gang history, right? It's a recent history. It goes along with that, you know, when it was peaking across the nation.
In the 90s.
But it was here.
Which gangs are prominent in our community, and where are they coming from?
It depends, like what, you know, how far you're willing to stretch the boundaries of the community. You know, I'm also looking down in Anthony, for example, right? And those gangs, you know, like in Chaparral, Anthony, kind of, you know, those outlying areas, you're going to see a heavy Juarez influence, right? Anapra and those colonias out to the west of Juarez, right? They seem to have migrated, you know, not a very far migration for them, you know, just into those kind of shantytown colonias down there. Las Cruces, you know, is going to have influences from El Paso, Albuquerque, and California. You know, we do have a lot of immigrants, or migrants, I should say, from California, just transplants, right?
In the different schools, I mean, you know, when I first moved to the Las Cruces area, there was always, you know, people saying, well, this school has more gang activity versus this school. I mean, is that the case, or gangs just pretty prominent throughout the different schools?
All the schools had them. You know, Oñate, for example, is one that kind of surprises people, you know, because it's kind of out there, sort of on its own on the East Mesa. But no school has been untouched. I don't know how old Centennial is, but you know, if it's been around long enough, I'd venture to say it had its issues at some time or another. But yeah, Las Cruces High, you know, Gadsden, of course, is pretty well known for having you know, gangs in certain periods of history and so forth.
How does the gang intervention program work? Is there a pretty well-established gang intervention program with the police department?
Here in Las Cruces, not so much. We do a lot of prevention, right? And in terms of our juvenile programs. So I think, you know, this community is pretty good about nipping it in the bud, to be honest. You know, we have the juvenile citation program, which is pretty unique. You know, you don't see a lot of cities that have this sort of program. So we here are pretty progressive, you know, from my standpoint as a juvenile justice scholar. We do a lot of stuff on the ground. You know, the PAL Boxing League. You know, we have a lot of stuff for kids to do here. So I think we've prevented the problem quite a bit.
Let's talk about prevention. You work with PAL Boxing League. What kind of program is that, and how does that involve children into getting them involved with an activity and getting them away from criminal?
Yeah, I mean, PAL is, you know, just one of your staple, long-standing, you know, Las Cruces, you know, intervention programs for youth. You know, it's located in the inner city, you know, on that older part of Solano, and it draws a lot of youth, you know, from that area who probably might otherwise be getting involved in other things. The one thing about boxing as a at-risk intervention is that it appeals to street kids, right? You know, these kids that have this orientation, and who like, you know, maybe, you know, getting into tussles and stuff like that. It's able to, you know, channel that type of energy, and you know, street kids glorify, you know, boxers quite a bit, you know, so it's a good thing, definitely.
Let's talk about your own personal history with gangs. Have you come across any former gang members that have opened up to you and have changed their ways as a result of this type of intervention?
That's tough. You know, I've definitely known a lot of gang-involved, you know, individuals. It's pretty well reflected in the book, of all ages, right, and of all involvement types. You know, this book has chapters on you know, Mexican mafia, Texas Mexican mafia in San Antonio, and you know, that sort of thing. So I've met, you know, and interacted with gang members of, you know, all types, right, under the Chicano context. And I have tried to reach out. I mean, I did start out as a social worker. It's a tough nut to crack, you know, because of where it really comes from, right? You know, it comes from cyclical family dysfunction and just like, you know, being marginalized from the mainstream. Kids, you know, that come from gang families and gang communities, they don't really have a schema for what it would take to get into college and stuff. And so you can work with them, but it's a really it's difficult to reverse generations of dysfunction basically in the communities and in the family.
Do you come across some of the reformed gang members? Do they go back in the community and work with current gang members to get them to get out of the gangs?
Yeah, certainly, right? And so I'll qualify what I just said by saying, of course, there's tons of exceptions, right? People have definitely, pulled themselves out of that context and made, a lot of themselves. And that tends to be the case, I find here in Las Cruces as well. Like a lot of people seem to have grown out of it and become something. And sure, they, most gang members, a lot of guys, wouldn't talk to me. They would only let me interview them on the condition, that the work would be used for that purpose, to reach out to today's youth and to try to, get some kids out of that lifestyle. So yes, I think gang members have a very strong sense about, don't do what I did, and let me try to teach you a different path.
Professor Mike Tapia, I want to thank you very much for joining us on Fronteras and Changing America, and wish you the best of luck with your upcoming work.
Thank you, Edmundo. It's been great.
Thank you for joining us on Fronteras and Changing America. I'm Edmundo Resendez. So that turned out pretty well.
Oh, good.
It goes by fast.
Yeah.
It really does.